Hi everyone, I'm Carla Sertin, a group editor here at ITP Media Group. I'm joined today by Twin Drums CEO Allan Cudicio and Yalla co-founder Farrukh Bandey to discuss success stories and to look at a reaction to the pandemic. So let's dive right into the conversation. Thank you both for joining us. I'm really excited to kind of discuss both of your businesses, both of your success stories, and really get into what you're doing in this space. So to start with, it would be great for us to get kind of an introduction to both of you, who you are and what your business really does. So I'd like to start with Farrukh. If you could tell me a little bit about Yalla and your position in that company.
Sure thing. Thank you so much for having us today. I really appreciate that. So as you mentioned, I'm the co-founder of Yalla. Yalla is we're a technology company based out of Saudi Arabia. We're actually a platform of lots of different products, mainly in the sports, entertainment, and tourism spaces. And within gaming and esports, our product is called Kufu Games, which is at the moment mainly a tournament platform for esports. The co-founder, head up our marketing and product teams. So I also come from a UX background. So Yalla was actually a product of Oxford Labs, which is our UX consultancy, which we started about 12 years ago out of Dubai originally, and then moved over to Saudi. We were always kind of wanted to do our own products. So our idea was we would kind of, rather than get investment, we would kind of self-fund our stuff from our client projects. And that was when Yalla was born. This was about 8 years ago in Saudi, so way before Vision 2030 and a lot of the changes we've seen in Saudi. So at the time, there was pretty much no digital ecosystem for anything in entertainment and gaming. And then we were very fortunate that we were at the right place, right time, and since things have exploded from there. We do a lot of work with the government, Ministry of Sports specifically. So we have a lot of the mega seasons that have been happening. We were in the entertainment side of that, so their ticketing and everything was done through us. And also with SafeBiz, which is the government entity in Saudi for esports and gaming. We partnered with them on a lot of their big projects and their tournaments, which is how we got entry into building our own product.
And Allan, if you could tell me a little bit about Twin Drums. You're more on the development side, on the game development side. If you could tell me a little bit about, your company and what you do.
Yeah. So hi, I'm Allan. Thanks again for the invitation so much. It's awesome to be here. And yeah, as you said, Twin Drums is a game development company. I started it myself last year. I have been in the industry for around 6 years. I started first more on the marketing side, then I switched into game development. I wanted to actually create the products. I have worked on some of larger franchises before, I was on the Candy Crush franchise for King. But then at some point, I realized I just had some stories I wanted to tell, and I needed to start my own company for it. So Twin Drums was born out of this desire. Specifically, the project we're working on currently is called the Wagadu Chronicles, which is the first MMORPG completely inspired by African traditions and cultures, and is very focused on role-playing as well. So if you're familiar with games like Dungeons and Dragons, we're kind of bringing that type of interaction of acting out your character into an online space. And specifically now, Twin Drums, we're around 10 people, a small indie company, so we work very agile. Remote based. I'm personally based mostly in Berlin, a bit in Accra, Ghana. And we just had a Kickstarter last month, which went quite well. We have Riot Games as well, who's League of Legends developer that's backing us for the development of the game. And we are meant to release the Wagadu Chronicles in a couple of years from now. So that's what we're focusing on at this point.
Yeah, that's really exciting. And I think both of you have brought up points that are really salient right now. So kind of feeling represented in video games, that's something that a lot of people are looking towards. And then Farrukh, your movement into the event space, like you said, it's just the right time in KSA. It's you joined at just the right moment. But obviously, we would be ignoring a huge backdrop if we didn't talk a little bit about the pandemic and how that's kind of changed things. And again, I think I want to start with you, Farrukh, because coming from an event space, I can imagine that the impact would have been very intense for Hala Yalla. So can you tell me a little bit about the impact of the pandemic and how you reacted?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, prior to the pandemic, so at the start of this year, the majority of our focus was in the event space because that was most of our big projects. So last year, the Ria season, Jeddah season, these kinds of big mega seasons that were going on, we were very much involved in it, and that made the bulk of our work. We were actually very fortunate that when the lockdown happened, so the measures that they took in Saudi, there was like a full-on lockdown, similar to what they did in Dubai. And so obviously the events industry essentially just went shut down completely. And we were actually very, very fortunate that we were able to pivot into gaming and esports very fast at the time because of so part of our platform, we had built the tournaments brackets. It wasn't a separate app at the time. When we first started it, it was stuff we were doing with the Ministry of Sports, as I mentioned. So they were running all these big tournaments within Saudi, because obviously gaming is huge there. It's a big part of entertainment. So we had already, around the end of last year, at the end of 2019, recognized, okay, this is a big opportunity for us. Let's pull this out and make it into a separate standalone product on its own. And we had like a roadmap for this year. And the idea was, we had a side team working on it. And the plan was by summer 2020 or the end of 2020 was when we were going to kind of properly launch it. Of course, the pandemic hit, and this 6-month, 7-month roadmap essentially got crushed into a 1-month roadmap because we had to switch everything, the whole team, onto this. Again, it was trial by fire. I mean, we made a lot of mistakes. It was besides the fact that we were switching the whole team's focus onto another product, having to quickly everybody go remote, the whole culture of the team and everybody kind of dealing with that, not to mention the psychological impact. It was difficult for everyone. I think everybody across the world kind of faced that. So it was a big impact for us, but I think we were very, very fortunate that we had this kind of access into the gaming and esports. And while things haven't fully recovered, we're doing okay now. After those first couple of months, we were able to kind of just get back on track and get the team back to being focused. Event stuff is still kind of happening. They're starting to pick up. And what we'd also done with our Hala Yalla super app, which is kind of like for booking experience and things like that, we're experimenting with online things. But again, that's still, there's still a lot of work to be done there.
And Allan, your perspective, I'm not really sure from the game development side, what's been the real impact of the pandemic, and have you had to adapt or pivot or delay in any way?
Yeah, so definitely, as Farrukh said, it's very momentous, and I would dare say that there's almost no business that had to adapt in some way to what happened. In our case, it was specifically an interesting mixed bag, because there's been a trend among some software developers and game developers to go remote, and it started before the pandemic, especially as a way to get talent across the world and like more diverse talent. Think about, for instance, the technical director in my team has a large family, and needs to be flexible with time in order to be able to take care of the kids with the partner and so on. So we already had this in mind, and already last year we started as a hybrid remote company where you could come to the office. We have like this small office in Berlin, or work remotely wherever you are in the world. And so it made it a bit easier. I wouldn't say easier, a bit easier to switch, because we already had those in place and most of our meetings were online. But of course, I think one thing that was a struggle was that we couldn't do, at this point, we haven't been able to do any onboardings in person or any catch-ups when we're planning some nice catch-ups to fly in people, have some, maybe spend the weekend together. All of those things didn't happen. So that meant like readjusting from, most of the team has grown completely remotely. So that was a challenge from a managerial point of view, like how do you keep people motivated? How do we get, for instance, like just getting to know each other, like, the sort of like coffee breaks that you'd have in an office. How do we build that type of, or maybe the travels you'd have and meet like once every couple of months? How do you build that? So that was definitely, mental health, as been mentioned by Farrukh, and I agree that's something we've been really looking at. So I feel so far we're at a good place, but that was definitely a challenge. I find an even bigger challenge was the whole B2B topic. I feel internally, I think we got to a good place in being a remote company, but then like meeting investors, for instance, like just having a phone call is not comparable to meeting someone at a conference, going for dinner, pitching your game. So I think that was, especially as a company that was starting looking for funding, even if overall the gaming industry has been growing, and actually in some way the pandemic has been a boost for the industry, it was very hard to translate that boost into productive meetings with potential business partners, because in the end, when you talk about money, like the face-to-face is really important. So again, those are challenges that we managed to overcome in some way, but definitely were sort of like very intense. And I do think in the end we are going to come out as a stronger company out of this, but I am looking forward as well to when vaccines get distributed.
Yeah, I think we're all looking forward to being able to have coffee together and, being able to meet not just over Zoom. But, again, you've made some interesting points specifically about culture and, as a small company, building, that investor relationship. That's definitely a very interesting point. And we're talking a little bit about the challenges, but I like to flip this over to the successes. So I'd like to hear a little bit about kind of the success stories that you've had, any kind of key moments for your brands. And once again, I'll just take it from Farrukh, if you could start us off.
Sure thing. So for us, the biggest thing this year was the Gamers Without Borders tournament that was sponsored by the Safest, the Saudi government, which was like an international gaming tournament around the world. It had two aspects to it. There was professional gamers competing, and there was like a $10 million prize pool for where the winners would donate it to a charity of their choice, charities that were fighting on the COVID pandemic. And then there was also community tournaments that were happening with regular prize pools where gamers from all over the world could join. So the community tournament aspect of it was something that happened on Cufu Games. And again, this was because of our partnership with the ministry, we were able to kind of get in on that project. We were very fortunate for that. So that was the biggest thing. We went from Cufu Games being a side project for us to it being front and center, and then within 2 months of not even 2 months, with about a month and a half of the lockdown happening, we were all guns blazing on this massive stage. So for us, that was about 2 months of gaming, continuous tournaments, hundreds of thousands of players registered on the platform. So that was amazing. That was a really, really big deal for us. So I think if we're talking about success stories purely from the COVID, that was, far above anything else. Since then, though, off the back of that, we've been able to continue the momentum on that. So we have constantly community tournaments that are happening, about 4 or 5 tournaments every week, which is helping us kind of keep that momentum going.
Yeah, I mean, talk about a silver lining, right? You've managed to adapt into something that's very interesting. And Allan, from your side, what are some of the big success stories that, out of Twin Drums?
Yeah, so definitely could say 2 things come in mind. So one is the team itself. Like one of my goals was, to tell like a very different story than what you see currently in games. So, rather than having something based on this Eurocentric fantasy, have something based on African traditions. And I wanted it to be told to by a team that is very diverse. And I think being forced to go 100% remote actually made it easier to find people from other parts of the world and more diverse people. So, for instance, currently the team is more than half women, which I think is a very big success in the gaming industry. That's very, very rare. And in general, like, from skin color to sexual orientation, like we have a lot of diversity in our team, and we still manage to build a good culture, and people are quite happy. So that's something that, I don't want to take for granted, and I'm really happy that we've managed to achieve. And then on the other hand, the product itself, it was a bit of a crazy bet to say, like, after so many years of industry consolidation around these tropes of, like Tolkien, Western fantasy, and so on, say, like, we're throwing this out of the window, we're making something, everybody in the game is black, it's just inspired by different parts of the continent. And so when we went out, it felt like very much like a bet. But then, first of all, we managed to build a lot of social media traction. And I think people being at home as well so much helped us, because they spend more time looking for new things, potentially. So that was maybe a, unexpected boost. And then finally, going to Kickstarter was a great validation. We managed to raise almost $200,000. So that showed not just like social media interest, but people actually are willing to put some money into the project and invest. And then of course, having a large developer like Riot Games say, hey, we're backing your project, we want to support you and make sure that you reach the finish line, was an additional kind of boost of confidence. And of course, financial support to say, okay, we're going somewhere, we're heading somewhere. So definitely this year, it was a challenging one, but I think it's good to look at the positives. And there's definitely like a lot for Twin Drums, like a healthy, diverse team, and a project that is like gaining momentum for the next couple of years.
And obviously both of your companies are very much technology driven, or they rely on technology. So I'm curious to hear if there are any kind of new technologies that you're implementing through your company, through either your game or your app, anything that might be of interest. And I'll start with Allan on this one, if there's any new technologies.
Yeah, so I wish I could give like a bit more glamorous answer to this, but I would say actually from a technology point of view, we're quite conservative. And that's something I would recommend in general as game developers. If you're like a small indie team, as we are, like using pre-existent tools out there is like the best solution to get a product out efficiently. So I know we did look at lots of interesting tools coming out there, especially because we're a multiplayer game in the networking multiplayer space. So I can really, especially, if you want to experiment a bit to a larger company, I can really recommend having a look at some, we had some interesting chats. But for us as a small independent team, like Unity, the game development engine has been our main tool. And that's because it's so easy to use and very accessible and well-known. So for us, it has been like a very like kind of boring and plain year so far. We'll see what the future takes. We might experiment a bit more, but yeah, Unity is the main tool we've used for development.
Yeah, and I mean, you still have a few more years before the game comes out. Who knows what will happen in the meantime? And then Farrukh, I'd like to take this to you. What new technologies is Yalla implementing?
Yeah, actually, I kind of agree with Allan, especially with one of the things when we have to consider with the technology stuff is the workforce and the ability to find talent who are able to work on cutting edge technology. I mean, we do a lot of R&D where we kind of encourage our teams to be experimenting with new technology, but from a practical sort of strategic business point of view, if you start building something with a tech that only a fraction of people actually know how to do very well, it becomes difficult when somebody's going on leave and then you don't have anybody else in the company who can actually continue the work. So we are cautious with that, and most of our products and the core of what we're doing is with nothing that is so cutting edge, the stuff that's sort of established. That said, I think in Saudi there's a lot of focus on AI, robotics, and Internet of Things, IoT. That's sort of been the case over the last couple of years. And specifically with IoT, that is something, because that comes from our event side of our work, that is something that we're constantly looking at. With a lot of the investment that's happening, and specifically in gaming, we know that there's going to be a lot of these gaming venues, big, larger gaming festivals. Hopefully, once the pandemic kind of dies down, vaccine gets rolled out, there will be a lot of effort there. So that is something that we are working on a lot. We've done that before with the event stuff that we're doing. But for us, the idea is that, if you're, registered for a big season that's happening at a physical venue, if you've got the app on you, once you entered into the gaming arena, it automatically recognizes that you're there, you get registered, and then there's a lot of other stuff that you can do with that as well, with sort of helping out vendors, promotions, etc., that are targeted to specific people based on specific interests. So I think specifically in gaming, IoT is probably what we're looking at, but that's more on the physical event side of it. We've been experimenting with blockchain a lot as well. Again, that was more on the ticketing side of things, but we want to look at that for our esports platform as well. But I think probably the biggest thing that we will be looking at in 2021 is fintech solutions, whether we build that on our own or if we do that in partnership with somebody else, because something we've experienced with a lot of the esports stuff is, handling getting people their prize money and everything like that is currently the solutions are not the smoothest experiences. Operationally, it becomes quite a headache. So that is something that we definitely want to be working on.
Yeah, and I mean, just speaking about these kind of future ideas and plans and looking ahead to, potentially events opening up again. Obviously, I'm not asking you to predict the future, but what do you have in store for 2021? What do you see in the future for both of your brands? And I think I'd like to hear from you, Farrukh, first, just in terms of Saudi Arabia in general. We're looking at this transition, we're looking at this transformation. What do you see in 2021, and what are your plans?
Well, obviously, a lot of it is going to depend on what happens with the pandemic. But it's even despite that, even with the pandemic, it's really exciting. Like I mentioned at the start, we're like right time, right place. There's so much happening. You've got the government support and investment. There's a big push towards, particularly in gaming and esports. Saudi Arabia wants to be a leader not just in the region, but globally. But besides that, we're seeing a lot of interest from private entities, particularly telcos. Everybody's wants to get into the gaming and esports industry. For me, I'm really excited about the wider ecosystem. There's up until the last 10 years, Dubai has been the regional startup hub, but over the last few years, there's a big push in Saudi for local startups, local companies, to kind of be building up. And I think if you take everything that's happening with esports and gaming and the investment that's happening, we're going to see sort of an explosion of local startups, whether it's in game development, platforms like ours, the physical side of it, so gaming venues, cafes, etc. That is going to be a big thing. We have already started like a small team, so we kind of experiment a lot with a lot of the stuff that we do. We're very big on the idea of, just build it, put it out there, put together an MVP, stick it out there. If it works, then we'll kind of invest a little bit more. And so for us, 2021, a big thing for us is game development. And actually, I think, like what Allan was saying about this idea of localized and actual, games where you're playing games that you recognize the people, you recognize the culture, you recognize the narrative, the story is something that is, we're really excited about. And I know that there's already people doing it. I think this whole idea of this localized products, if you want to call them, is not just for gaming. We were already seeing it out of the region in Saudi, specifically in Saudi, whether it's film, art, music, all of that is happening. So I think for us, a big part of what we're going to be doing next year is looking into the game development side of things.
Wow, that'll be a very interesting development, I think. And like you say, localized content, it's always interesting for us. And speaking of which, we'll move to Allan. If you can tell us a little bit about your plans for 2021, and what you're looking to, where you see Twin Drums moving in the next year.
Yes, so it's definitely a very exciting year. Hopefully, depends on the pandemic as well, like the degree of excitement. But I think anyways, there's a lot happening. I think somehow we're going to move from like the shock and adaptation of this year into just like continuing with more momentum. And as I said, if you survive this year, then somehow you're stronger to continue next year. And that's how it feels in the case of Twin Drums. And our goal is to hit an first alpha at the end of next year, which means that for the first time, players are going to come into an early version of the game, play it, start giving feedback. And that's because we're planning to do the second year, so the following year, as a completely open, iterative process where players are playing the versions of the game and giving us feedback, and we keep on improving it before the final release in 2 years' time. So this process is starting. I think that's something that we're seeing in the industry more and more, like people going into companies going into early access, or releasing betas or even alphas of the game, gathering feedback. And I would say in general, live operations. So game becoming, being online as a service, software as a service for games. And the earlier, the better. So that's something I'm really excited of. I've done this in other games. I mentioned Candy Crush. I've done it for other games. Being online, having your users and players provide feedback, basically live while you're creating things, and being able to see numbers and reactions is just kind of the goal for next year. And it's something, as a MMORPG developer, I'm really looking forward to. And very much, I'm going to pick it up from Farrukh, and I agree, like IPs, like kind of new IPs is something I'm really excited about. That's kind of the whole point of the Wagadu Chronicles as well, to tell different stories. And, let's call them localized stories. And I think one thing that's really interesting is that I don't think it's going to be only for local audiences. I think there'll be people excited out there, and it's already happening in our case, from the US or from Asia, like, to play a game inspired by African mythologies. And I think it's going to be the same from, I can imagine, I would love to play a game inspired by, Arab stories and histories and folklore and, or even Arab futuristic stories, some sort of like Wakanda from Saudi Arabia. Like, I'm up for it. So I'm really curious to see. And I think that there is out there, like, more and more, there's been something that has changed, some trigger. We've seen that happening as well with the whole BLM movement in the US. People want to know more and understand the stories of people who are not just, the mainstream white society from the West. And I think for the medium of games, this is a great opportunity, and it's happening. So next year, I think we'll see more interesting things on the horizon.
Yeah, that's certainly, there's a lot to look forward to, it seems like. I think the one question that I'd like to leave our audience with is maybe if you have any advice, any tips on operating in this vertical, in each of your verticals, because, we've heard a little bit about some of the challenges, the successes, what has lent to your success? What advice would you give to someone who's trying to start operating in this industry? And I'll start with Farrukh, if you could give us your tips.
Sure. Well, so I come from a UX background and the basic user experience design, and the basic, fundamental idea of the UX process is that you design around the user, and that aspect kind of applies to any part of the business. It's like, if you don't have a customer, if you don't aren't building what they want or what they need, you're not going to get anywhere. So that's the starting point. The other thing that we really kind of focus on is our sort of approach. It's a very lean approach, where we're kind of, you don't just build everything and then put it out there. You want to do it as Allan mentioned, you want to do it iteratively. So you kind of put something out there, continuous feedback loops of get that, whether it's a survey. I mean, I'm a big fan of getting out there and actually talking to people directly, watching them use your product and actually see what they're doing and then learn that. Now, a very important distinction here is you don't ask people what they want. You don't ask people what you should do. You want to see how they actually do things. You want to observe their behavior. You want to observe kind of how they're using your product, and then feed that back into your design. So for us, that's like a big part of everything we do with all our products and our businesses. The other thing I think is, like, so with localization, so I'll just kind of jump back onto that, is that there is sometimes people think that localization means just like, translating. We can take, before, like previously there used to be a habit of like, we'll take a product that's successful in the West and then we'll just copy it and do it here. That might have worked in the past, but I think now, especially in the region in Saudi, audiences are way too mature for that. They've already had access to everything that's out in the world. They know when you're just trying to copy something and pass it off as like, here, this is for you. You can't get away with that. You might get away with that at the beginning, but long term, you've really got to pay attention to what are the trends that people in the audiences that you're looking for. So whether it's in Saudi, whether it's in UAE, whether it's in Egypt, and again, those places are different. Yes, they speak Arabic, but even within Arabic, the dialects can be different. What people are talking about, what the content that are consuming on social media, what they're watching on Netflix, it's going to be different. So make sure that you really laser focus and understand who your audience is, and then build out from there.
Mm-hmm. And Allan, your insight?
So first of all, I just want to say I 100% agree with everything Farrukh said. It applies for game development, of course. And then additionally, I'll say two things come in mind. One is like to start small, which people say a lot, but if you look at, now I'm working on an MMORPG, so you think, oh, let me start such a game. Like if you look at my first games many years ago, there were like some really tiny, ugly platformers with some ugly zombie running around. So you want to really start small learn your lessons. In between, I got to work with like larger and larger games, either as side projects or if you're fortunate enough, even in a professional company, but it doesn't have to be. Like, there's really lots of interesting, great people online, especially now, thanks to the pandemic, actually, who are willing to find others to work on games as even side projects or, like ways to learn game development. So really start there. And then once you have more experience, move it to something more complex. I think that's something really many people forget, and maybe start with something, how do you say, like bite more than you can chew, right? So I think that's really important. And then the other thing I just cannot recommend enough is to speak with people, like as early as possible, pitch your idea, get feedback. Some people are afraid to share the idea because someone might steal it. And one thing I would say is like, everybody thinks they have the best idea. No one is going to steal your idea. Like, ideas are cheap. Like, yes, you need a good idea for a game, but there's a lot of good ideas out there that are never realized. No one ever makes anything out of them, or they just realize badly. So idea is like, just talk about it, get feedback, refine it. And then it really helps, because someone might go, oh, look, like I have this friend who was looking to work on a similar project, or put you in touch. Or it's like, oh, you know what, there's this investor that was looking for, and then, things move on. So just, get feedback on things, meet other people, even online. And I think overall, like building a network and feedback really helps. So these would be my 2 tips for upcoming game developers.
Okay, well, I'd like to thank both of you for joining me today for this discussion. It's been really insightful, and it's always great to hear some success stories from this vertical, which can be very challenging, and to hear kind of how you've overcome some of the challenges of this year. So thank you both for joining me in this discussion today. We really appreciate you giving some time to provide your insights. And thank you to...
Thanks for having us. You're welcome.
Thanks for having
us. Of course. And thank you to our audience for tuning in. Stay tuned for our next session in DGC.
No, that was very inspirational. Oh my God. These successful stories actually really motivates me and everybody else in the gaming community and world. So you know what? Maybe you will be the next success story that we'll be talking about in the next DGC, right? Anyways, ladies and gentlemen, back to esports. Now, one of the biggest names we've ever seen so far in the esports field, we've seen a lot of brands, but ESL changed the game for us when it comes to esports. Now, the next session is about how ESL changed the esports game. Let's go.